and in between, on the other months, we meet jointly with the Acadiana Housing Alliance. And so this is the month where we focus primarily on ARCH. And we have a pretty full agenda, so we're going to get started right away. I'm really grateful to everybody who's joined us today. Go ahead and continue to place your names and the agency that you are affiliated with, if any, in the chat box so other folks can know who's on the call with us today. I do have everybody muted at this time so that just because once you get a lot of folks on the call, it starts to be a lot of background noise, but we will unmute, or you can unmute yourself at the time when we are open for questions so that we can have a little bit more of a discussion. But at that time, if you're not the one speaking, then I would ask you to put yourself back on mute so that we don't end up with a lot of background noise. So our agenda today will include a local update on things that have been happening in the last couple of months. And then we are really excited to have a speaker joining us today from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so I'm going to get started pretty quickly here with our local update so we can get to her portion of the presentation, because I think it's one I'm really excited to hear. So let me get my screen up where you guys can see it, and then we'll get started. Okay, are you guys able to see my screen at this point? Okay, great. Thanks for the thumbs up, Greg. All right, so we're going to talk today. I know some folks are joining us for the first time, so I do want to just review kind of basically what ARCH is, Acadiana Regional Coalition on Homelessness and Housing. Our mission is to ensure that everyone in Acadiana has access to safe, affordable, and stable housing, and that all episodes of homelessness are rare, brief, and non-recurring. We know that the issue of homelessness and the issue of stable housing are two sides of the same coin. Safe, affordable, stable housing is the solution to homelessness. And when we are able to find opportunities for housing, then we reduce the amount of homelessness that's in our community. So we have to work on those things simultaneously. ARCH is the HUD, as in Department of Housing and Urban Development, continuum of care. We're HUD designated organization to provide collaboration in applications for the federal funding, as well as monitoring of those funds. And then we work as a collaborative to find opportunities where there are gaps in services and to track data and metrics and how well we're being able to assist people who are in unstable housing and homelessness. And so we've had a lot going on in the last, almost 12 months now, between COVID and then 2 hurricanes that have hit our area locally. And then most recently with this really hard cold freeze. And so we've seen over the last several months a tremendous increase in homelessness and housing insecurity at the same time that we've seen shelters and resources decrease capacity in order to meet COVID safety requirements. And also, as we've seen, some shelters in the area have to permanently close due to lack of funding or other reasons. And so there has been significant gaps formed as we've seen an increased need and a decrease in the ability of the existing resources to meet that need. And ARCH's role generally in the community is one of interagency information sharing and problem solving, communications, and as I mentioned earlier, gap filling. And normally that happens as a collaborative, and so this has been an ongoing role. I think one thing that has happened more recently is that the direct service is typically provided by other agencies that are part of the coalition. But as those agencies were stressed to the max and have been operating at full capacity to the degree that COVID is allowing with the response after COVID, there was even more need. And so ARCH has stepped in as a direct service provider, which is a fairly new role for ARCH. And so we did that with the COVID non-congregate sheltering program. You all the ones that have been on this call before have heard us talking about that program. Today, there are still about 170 households in that non-congregate sheltering program, which is sheltering through hotels. And then recently, because the COVID non-congregate sheltering program does not have ability to add new individuals or households to it, we've seen the numbers of people continuing to grow who are unsheltered homeless. And so going into this hard freeze a couple of weeks ago, we had just a tremendous number of people who were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We estimated that it was going to be approximately 300 households across our region. And what we actually found was that it was higher than that. But we knew that there was a need for providing additional shelter so that people could survive the freeze. And this community really stepped up to the plate to provide in a very collaborative manner an opportunity for people to get inside. And so I wanted to share some highlights of that effort. These numbers are preliminary. This, of course, just happened, and we just actually, Tuesday morning was the checkout for most people who are part of this program. So we are still collating and deduplicating data. But at this time, it's approximately 579 households that we know received shelter through the freeze efforts. Again, we thought we were going to see about 300, so this is a big increase. That represents about 780 individuals. You can see a breakdown of parishes. The large majority of folks were sheltered in Lafayette. There was a good population in Acadia and St. Martin parishes as well, and smaller, but it's still several in Iberia, St. Landry, St. Mary, and Vermilion. Our effort did not include any people identified in Evangeline Parish, which I would hurry to emphasize does not mean that there was not a need in Evangeline Parish, but one of the gaps for Evangeline Parish is the ability to go locate people in that parish who need the access to shelter. And so just knowing how to offer the assistance to people out there is a challenge for us right now. So the question I get asked immediately after I talk about that big number is always, were all those people outside, and are they back outside now? And the answer is, by and large, yes. There was at least 68% of the folks that we saw come into the freeze shelter who would be categorized as what we call literally homeless, who are sleeping outside, sleeping in their cars, in sheds, abandoned buildings, barns, etc. There was about 11% that we would categorize as housing insecure. Generally speaking, they are couch surfing or motel hopping, where they pay for their own hotel room. They go from couch to couch with family members, not on the same couch every night, just bouncing as they can find a space. And on one of the nights when we were experiencing freezing temperatures, they could not locate a couch. So those folks are in this kind of housing insecure category. There was another population of people who reached out for assistance during the freeze sheltering efforts who typically are housed, but for some reason during the freeze, they did not have any heat And so that was our population of people who either live in housing that doesn't have heat on a regular basis. Oftentimes you hear of people on cold nights using their stove or something like that to heat their properties. There's also a number of folks who had gas leaks or who had frozen pipes, which then required utilities to be shut off and therefore leaving them without heat in their home. And so that population was also included in this free sheltering effort. The other unknown category is largely as a result of the data not being completely analyzed yet. So most of this population will go into one of those other categories as we move forward with cleaning up that data. I think some things to take note of in this effort is that, as I mentioned, the numbers in general were higher overall. We also saw a much higher number than expected of the individuals that are in this 18 to 24-year-old range. One of the things that ARCH as a coalition has done for the last several years is tried to identify if we have persons that fall into this young adult category who are experiencing homelessness within our communities, where are they? Nationwide, there's been an increase in efforts to try to address homelessness for that population. And we have not been very successful in locating where those populations are. We know there's a lot of folks that couch surf that are that age, but the ones that are truly, literally homeless have been difficult for us to identify. During this freeze, we were able to identify about 50 individuals that fall into this age range who are experiencing that literal homelessness outside or in a shed or in their car. And so we're really grateful now to have begun to engage that population and to hopefully begin to find some solutions for that population. Of course, it's a sad statistic, but I'm also very grateful that the freeze provided the opportunity for us to get a better handle on what those needs look like. There were 68 families that had children who participated in the freeze non-congregate sheltering program, and 35 households that were in the program that identified Hurricane Laura or Delta as the cause of their homelessness. And so, again, these are populations where we're working really closely to try to help get them connected to resources that might be able to assist with ending their homelessness quickly and or restoring them back to the housing that they were in previously. Before I move on to funding, I want to take a quick second to emphasize that while ARCH served in part as a point and lead, there has definitely been a tremendous amount of collaboration throughout the region with organizations who have helped to identify people who needed the services, who created opportunities for getting food and other essential items to folks that were in the hotel program. And also not just agencies, but individuals, neighbors calling about neighbors. And so it really took the entire community to make this happen and get it done. And of course, a number of folks who donated to cover the cost of those hotels. So circling back, the funding that has come through from the federal government specifically to address housing instability and homelessness across the country, largely as a result of COVID-19. I get a lot of questions about it. And so I wanted to, this is a very simplified overview, but, and we can dive deeper into it in future conversations, but just real quick, and as sort of a transition to our speaker, I wanted to identify that originally with the CARES Act funding, we saw some funding come into the region that is largely being utilized to help people who are in the COVID hotel program transition back into housing. And so there's funding there that has been utilized for that or is in the process of being utilized for that. There's some upcoming money that's coming out of the second stimulus package that was passed. That is the Treasury Rental Assistance funding. And that rental assistance is not yet activated or on the ground available to people, but it should be very soon. Within, I would say, hopefully the next 6 weeks, we can begin to see some people having access to rental assistance, which would hopefully prevent additional homelessness across our community in a pretty meaningful way, because it allows for really helping to stabilize paying back arrears, things of that sort, for those folks that are still in their housing and who are in need of some assistance with catching up on their rent payments. And then I don't want to say too much about advocacy needed, because I want to leave that information for our speaker to talk about, but I want to point out that by and large, this Treasury rental assistance is for folks that are still in housing, and we've seen a number of households who have become unsheltered kind of between funding packages. So we had one package through the CARES Act that helped to get people moved into hotels if they became unsheltered, and is now working to get that population back into housing. But as we had to stop in taking people into that program, people still became homeless. This Treasury Rent Assistance Program will keep more people from becoming homeless, but the folks that have already become homeless kind of caught in between. And so we need to see some work at the federal government level to address the population of folks that are already homeless to help reconnect them to housing. So I'm gonna stop here and offer an opportunity for, if you want to, take yourself off mute and ask a question about any of what I've already sort of covered here.
Hey Lee, this is Latoya.
Hey.
With the Family Connection. Hey, how's it going? Have y'all reached out? You said y'all having trouble with the Evangeline Parish. There's an organization called Family Strong, but they're located in St. Landry, but I believe they work in St. Landry and Evangeline Parish. Have y'all ever reached out to them?
I'm not familiar with them, no. So if there's some, if you can connect us, that would be real helpful.
They don't have a website or anything, but they have a Facebook page. I know some of my people have used them before, and they do a lot of different things like classes and things like that for that area. So they're in touch with a lot of the community. So that might be a good resource for that area.
Great. I will definitely reach out.
Awesome.
Lee, this is Nell Hahn, and I was wondering, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering, you talked a little bit about the limitations on taking new people into the COVID homeless program, and then again, you said you can't add new. Can you tell a little about that?
Yeah, sure. So the COVID non-congregate sheltering program, which began in late March, as a local effort, and then eventually around the middle of May, the state, through the Louisiana Housing Corporation, began to pay the hotels as we populated them with people experiencing homelessness. And that funding comes from FEMA. Originally, it was just like other FEMA funding, set up as a cost share, so that the state was responsible for 25% of the cost, and the federal government was saying that they would reimburse 75%. But it's a reimbursement process. So the state, through Louisiana Housing Corporation, has across the state implemented non-congregate sheltering programs to assist people who were unsheltered during the pandemic. And at about early August, they issued a stop. They said, we can't take any more people into that program. And in large part, that's about cash flow. It's a tremendous cost to continue to pay hotel rooms for the growing population of people experiencing homelessness. And the reimbursement from FEMA is extremely slow and tedious. And so the state has reached kind of their limit without getting a faster turnaround from the federal government. And so that's not just an issue for Louisiana, that's an issue across the country. And the Biden administration has approved 100% reimbursement from FEMA. So states no longer have to worry about carrying the 25% match, but they still have to worry about paying for it right now. And how long is it going to take to get that money back? And so our state, and I know many others, have not been willing to start the program back up until they see faster responses from the federal government. But in theory, if everything worked, I think as it is supposed to be working, we could have, no unsheltered homelessness right now. Anybody who wanted shelter could have access to it. But in reality, the logistics of that are not proving that out.
I'm sorry, but in hurricanes and stuff like that, doesn't FEMA pay the hotels directly?
I don't know all the ins and outs on the disaster assistance programs and how that works, but this is not set up the same way as those are.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Lee. It's Carla. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi.
I guess I just wanted to speak briefly and answer Nell's question. Just speaking from my experience thus far, having worked with individuals displaced by hurricanes, mostly Delta, not so much Flora, but what I've observed is FEMA is providing rental assistance for those who have filed claims with the paperwork that they find appropriate, such as pictures of before and after the damage, and any other reports or estimates as needed. And so let's say someone who doesn't have access to all that paperwork or who isn't able-bodied to acquire all that paperwork that can be tedious when, working with local government, their claim is denied, and then they have the right to appeal. And so it's kind of in that weird appeal process, someone may be waiting for a certain report, or let's say their essential documents such as birth certificates were lost. It's when individuals that, survivors aren't able to get that paperwork together, that is a hurdle that prevents them from receiving rental assistance from FEMA. So at this time, I've been kind of working with survivors that I'm case managing for, trying to get them housing through the USDA office that offers rent according to the person's income. And that in itself is a process because there's a constant list that's updating, and people that apply need to provide their FEMA registration number. So it's a lot of nuance right now, and it's really tricky, and it's not super straightforward. But I will say, I can't speak for every single experience, but thus far for the 4 people that I've been case managing for, that's what I've been witnessing. FEMA can't or won't disseminate funds until the claim is perfectly accepted or their appeal is approved entirely.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Carla. Any other questions or comments here? Okay, well then I'm going to ask Elsa to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Lee. So I am super excited today to welcome Olivia Arena. She's a housing advocacy organizer for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Prior to her work there, she spent several years conducting place-based social and economic policy research in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization in Washington, D.C. And at Urban, Her research focused on equitable development and neighborhood change, food access, climate resilience, housing as a platform for service delivery, and the 2020 census. She specialized in community engaged research and conducting projects in communities across the country, and honed her network management skills as a staff member of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership. So across each of these topics, Olivia recognized the importance of just housing policy and identified the urgency of building political will to protect and expand affordable housing options in this country. Prior to her work at Urban, Olivia graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, where she earned a bachelor's degree in international relations and global studies and urban studies. And I had a delightful conversation with her yesterday, so informative, and I'm very thankful that she was able to take some time today to share with us her information. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Olivia Arena. That was a great intro to the work that I've done. And actually at Urban, I did a lot of work on climate resilience, specifically in the Gulf Coast. So I worked in and around New Orleans down to Dulac, Louisiana. And I'm from Houston originally. So, you know, my family still lives there and went through the last 2 weeks without, you know, encountering the same type of freeze and the same conditions, and grew up experiencing hurricanes. So a lot of what you're talking about is close to me personally and close to my work that I do at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'm going to do that Zoom thing where I make sure that I'm sharing my screen. Let me go ahead and make sure on a moment that I have a presentation. Share screen. Here we go. Probably don't see it yet. Okay. Do you see slides now? Okay, awesome. And I'm a talker. At any point, feel free to stop me and ask questions, unmute or put questions in the comment box, and I'll be able to answer them at the end. But like I said, my name is Olivia Arena. I am a housing advocacy organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition based out of Washington, D.C. I'm really excited to be here. I've already learned a lot. And let me tell you that y'all are already part of the advocacy process, both in your local communities and at the federal level. And I'll talk a little bit more about what advocacy means to us and how I think you're already building a lot of the structure and foundation that you need for good advocacy. But I can tell you how to plug into our network and some of the tools that we recommend folks use in their communities every day. So like I said, I've worked in housing and community development policy and research, and now I'm on a field team. And through all of my work in food justice and climate justice, it's important to recognize the centrality of having an affordable home. So I probably don't need to tell all of y'all this, but it's crucial that folks in our country have access to safe, decent, accessible homes. And it's a key part of our lives. As we're seeing now with the COVID epidemic, it's important for public health. It's important for economic productivity. It's important for our student lives. But right now, our nation is facing an unprecedented housing affordability crisis, which is most negatively impacting people with the lowest incomes. So there's millions of households that are paying far more of their rent than they can afford. And this means that renters with the lowest incomes have very little left over. They're driven deeper into poverty. They have greater risks of housing instability, eviction, and then in worst cases, homelessness. And you'll see that with very little left over for savings, folks are often one car breakdown, one missed job shift, or one medical bill away from housing instability or homelessness. And I want to be clear that this is not just an urban issue. Actually, our research shows that there is not a single county in the United States where someone earning minimum wage and working just 40 hours a week can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And I'll go a little bit more into what that looks like and what that looks like in Louisiana in this presentation. So here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, our mission is specifically about those that have the lowest incomes in our country. So while there are many organizations that concentrate on homeownership and housing policy, we're unique in that our sole focus is on the needs of renters with extremely low and very low incomes. And we focus on those groups because our research shows that that's where the greatest need is, and that by focusing solutions on the lowest income renters will actually alleviate some of that higher, the tension and the pressure and housing issues further up the income ladder. So while we support homeownership and we support middle income renters, we really focus on the folks that are most at risk of homelessness. We focus on folks experiencing homelessness and on low income renters. And though our mission is a little bit specific, like I just mentioned, we actually are a membership organization. And at the end of this, I'll recommend that all of you join as members or engage with our work. But we have a pretty large umbrella for who is part of our network. So we have homeless service providers, we have low-income residents that join as individuals, housing authorities, landlords, and developers. So our policies are meant to inform all of that advocacy at the federal level for all of those individuals. So I know that y'all all work in the housing and homelessness space. I just want to, again, talk a little bit about the research we use in our advocacy and how you can use it in your own efforts. But affordable to us and to, by HUD standards means a home is considered to be affordable when the household is spending no more than 30% of their income on rent and essential utilities. So folks that are spending more than 30% are cost burdened, and folks that are spending more than 50%, so half of their income on rent, are severely cost burdened. And again, have very little left over for savings, have very little left over to try and get ahead, and very little to spend just on themselves when they're spending so much on rent. So we know that this looks different in different communities. So we base everything on area median income, which is calculated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, for each geography. And that's kind of where we base what low income is or very low income in a given area. So again, we focus on folks that are extremely low income, so 30% of less of the area median income, or 50% and below. And that's really where we believe we need to be focusing as a country, because right now there's not naturally occurring affordable housing. There's actually a major deficit, and there's not incentives to build housing because those households just don't make enough to afford market rent. There's basically no private market solutions to provide adequate, affordable, safe, and decent housing to these income groups. And that's why we need federal advocacy. So our research shows that right now, extremely low income housing, so those at 30% of the median income and below, are facing the largest shortage of housing. Actually, about 7 million rental homes, affordable and available, that's what the shortage is for extremely low income individuals. So right now there's 11 million extremely low income individual households in our country, and only 7 million, there's a gap of 7 million units. So whenever we're thinking about who we really need to be building for, that 7 million number is what comes to mind. What that means for like a group of 100 people is that for every 100 households, there are only 36 affordable and available homes for extremely low income renters. So that's an incredible gap. And you see that that's actually the greatest need. They're at the lowest income household level. There's actually a surplus at some of the higher incomes. So when we're building housing, we're building it for folks that have higher incomes. There's not housing that's being constructed that's affordable for the folks in our country that have the least. And like I said, it's not an urban phenomenon. This shortage exists nationwide. And as you'll actually see on this map, Nevada has the greatest shortage of affordable homes. So there's only 18 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income renter households. And West Virginia has the most, and that's still just 62. So there's still a major gap, those 38 households for every 100 households missing in West Virginia. So you'll see on Louisiana here, there's only 42 available and accessible affordable units for every 100 extremely low income households. So that's less than 50. And this is really where we see the intersection of housing and work, housing and labor, housing and wages. It's not just that this housing doesn't exist, but it's also that households are working and they just can't afford to make ends meet. Actually, 37% of these extremely low income households are in the labor force, and others are disabled or they're seniors. So the real challenge isn't that folks aren't working, it's that working isn't paying the bills anymore. because wages have remained stagnant, especially for low rate wage jobs, and the rents have increased due to demands and inadequate supply. So many of the jobs that are most popular in the US, so I'm thinking secretaries, motor vehicle operators, financial clerks, food service workers, like they just cannot make ends meet. So our annual out of reach report estimates that by calculating a housing wage, so this on this map right now in the United States, this is how much someone needs to be making an hourly wage working 40 hours a week to be able to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. So in Louisiana, someone needs to be making $17.48 an hour just to have a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Across the United States, the number is $23 an hour. So that's about 97 hours a week the average worker working minimum wage would need to be working over 2 jobs, full-time jobs, to be able to afford rent. And here's where we get to Louisiana specifically. So 30% of your households are extremely low income, and 69% of those households are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. So that means that one of their checks every month is immediately going to cover rent and utilities for 70%, and that leaves very little for other necessities like savings. So when we're thinking about that link between housing and homelessness, folks just don't have enough to save for emergencies. And thinking back to those amounts that I talked about at the national level, there's, like I said, only 42 homes available for 100 renter households in Louisiana, and your renters are paying the majority of their income on rent. Now, when we look at the wages for Louisiana, the housing wage is a little bit lower at $17.48 an hour, but that's still over twice as much as your minimum wage. So another way to put this is that a minimum wage worker in Louisiana would have to work 80 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom apartment and 96 hours a week to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And you can see that in Lafayette, the housing wage is actually a little bit higher. So it's $17.54, and that minimum wage is still just not enough to make ends meet. As the data show, there's an inadequate supply of affordable housing, wages have not kept pace, and there's not enough federal funding flowing to housing assistance programs. And I set the stage with all of this data because it's really helpful in your advocacy efforts to enter the conversation with both stories, so the experiences you shared at the beginning part of this call, and hard numbers. So regardless, this is what analysis says, this is what data says, folks are working, would have to work almost 2 jobs to afford a 1-bedroom. And then you can couch that in the different stories from your clients, folks you're working with, your neighbors, to really make an impact in advocacy. We also know, and it's already been said on this call, that when folks are housing cost burdened, they make sacrifices. So 61% of people in the US say they've had to make a sacrifice in the last 3 years because they were struggling to pay for housing. So that means they cut back on school, they skipped bills, they took an additional job, they cut back on healthy foods, and that impacts all of these other areas of life and all of these other areas of health. So we really see housing as a health priority, a social justice priority, an education priority. And it's important to think of it that way because your advocacy and your coalition building will be a lot stronger when you tap into those other networks. So what are our priorities? We're a nonpartisan organization. So we at NLIHC support any good housing policy that helps us achieve our mission, regardless of what side of the aisle it comes from, because good housing policy affects every person and community across the political spectrum. It's really important that on the federal level, you keep in mind who you're talking to and how you craft your message. But at the end of the day, we always say good policy is important for everyone. And we think that folks agree with us. So again, looking back at that data, 85% of the public believes that a safe, decent, affordable place to live should be a top national priority. And we've seen this right now. Congress has extended the CDC eviction moratorium, and President Biden has emphasized that this is important. It's like unprecedented that right now federal action is being taken on housing, affordability, and homelessness in such a proactive way. And it's largely the result of advocates like the same people in this room raising their voices and really pushing on their congressional representatives. So what we're asking for is a lot of what I'm hearing in the same room. Housing stability needs to be a priority right now during the pandemic and after. So I really appreciate the tee-up that was talking about Treasury dollars and rental assistance. I can answer any questions about this, but there have been some resources. There's just a lot more needed. So right now, the House and Senate soon are actually considering a financial package to add additional rental emergency assistance, $5 billion in housing choice vouchers, $5 billion for homeless services, and potentially an extension of the federal eviction moratorium. So these are actions that need to be taken right now to support the very folks that you've been talking about that have fallen through the cracks, that need additional rental assistance, that have nowhere else to go. We need additional federal relief in a COVID package. But we also can't lose sight of this needs to be setting the stage for longer term solutions to housing affordability. So I mentioned all of those issues with stagnant wages, not enough supply, trying to help folks get what they need. And it's using those emergency systems and emergency relief to really help folks through this time, but ultimately to craft longer term solutions. So we kind of have bucketed our housing and homelessness solutions into these larger groups. So bridging the gap between income and housing costs, such as rental assistance and expanding income and housing, and expanding and preserving affordable housing through the National Housing Trust Fund. We want to prevent evictions, such as a national stabilization fund, and ensuring equitable disaster recovery. So I've already heard this on the call, how folks who have to navigate the FEMA process can fall further behind when they can't get that assistance. We actually convene a national coalition, and I'll put the link in the chat, the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, that pushes and advocates for more renter-focused, more equitable disaster recovery relief. And ultimately, through all of this, we believe you need to be prioritizing racial and income inequities because housing policy is one of the areas where we've had the most disparity in our country. We sent a memo to the Biden transition team, and I can put the link, it's in this presentation, but in the chat, that outlines some of our priorities. So how do we make it happen? These are all very exciting proposals and possibilities, but they can't come into practice without voices like ours and voices like yours. National advocacy groups like mine draw on the experiences of folks on the ground to really ground our mission and ground our solutions. So we can be effective in moving things forward by meeting with Congress, but ultimately it's your voices, specifically as constituents and as voting constituents, that really hold your representatives accountable. So what is advocacy? Advocacy is simply educating others about the issues in your community and pushing them to care for what you care about to improve the lives of your neighbors. So many of you as individual community members and social service providers see the affordable housing and homelessness crisis every day. And you can have a tremendous impact by sharing these stories with your elected officials and urging them to act. Unfortunately, though, we often hear, and I myself am guilty of this, my elected officials are a lost cause, or they already support homelessness and housing, so what's the point? We all have limited capacity, we're in front of screens all day, so why my voice and why now? I'm going to urge you to think about, when you're thinking about your goal for advocacy, thinking of it on a spectrum. There are staunch opponents and staunch supporters. So you don't need to worry about if your call is going to pick up the phone and change someone overnight, change their opinion. But when you're thinking about advocacy, it's important to keep in mind that the goal of this work is to determine where folks stand on an issue and then move them along a spectrum. And definitely don't get defeated. It will take a coalition and many voices saying the same thing to help strengthen and get your point across. But let's say your elected official is a staunch opponent of affordable housing. Not going to happen, doesn't want to spend the money, doesn't see that it's pivotal to all these other places and folks and areas of life. Your goal with advocacy is just to get them to maybe be a little quieter on the issue or objections to affordable housing. Or let's say you already have a supporter in Congress. Your goal is to nudge them to break out of their comfort zone and stand up with you and take strong and vocal positions. So there's always more work to be done And I would say never take anyone for granted. And that's what we see in federal advocacy, that folks can really move the needle by voicing their concerns and by telling their stories. So what motivates politicians? Well, your elected officials make their decisions about votes considering their political party and what their constituents value. At the end of the day, they are responsive to you. You can vote them out of office, and by sharing your views, you can play a central role in crafting their policy agenda. We've seen this throughout COVID with the way folks are responding to their constituents. What's important is that you get your story out there and that you use stories and you use data to undergird your message and you bring others along with you. So here are some of the pillars we've identified as essential to an advocacy campaign. First, you want to identify your goal. Again, it could be, we really want better. Right now, we're asking Treasury to put out more comprehensive and detailed guidance on that emergency rental assistance program. So what do local practitioners need to know? We've identified a goal, and you need to identify not only your goal, but is it incremental or is it fundamental? What scale, what scope are you going for? And really calibrate that. What do you have capacity for right now? It will help inform the next steps you take. So again, you don't need to necessarily change someone's view overnight, but maybe you say, wouldn't it be great if we told the story of, this devastating freeze that just happened to 5 different lawmakers and really, honed our message. You want to identify the right target of your advocacy efforts. So doing your research to understand what drives policymakers, how they define the problem, what are the other things they're weighing. This will help you inform the tactics that you might consider to influence them. Are there things they've already weighed in on? Are there positions they've already taken that maybe you could remind them of? Or is there something they really care about, like childcare, education, that you could fit housing into? Then you want to assess the strengths and limitations of your coalition. Do you have strengths in numbers? Are you connected to elected officials? Are you connected to the media, which I will get to in a moment? But it's really important to message and brand your campaign and to leverage these tools that are already available to you. And be realistic about your capacity. Who's in the room, who's not? Can lead your campaign? Who can tell those stories? Making sure that you're building a broad base. Also create an agenda. It's very important that you establish your priorities very clearly, the objectives you need to meet your goal, and ultimately consider what compromises you might be willing to make. Everything is a trade-off, and what are you comfortable with will be important so you know where to draw the line. And ultimately, pick a place to focus your energy. I'm talking about at the federal level, but all of these strategies can apply to your city council member, to your state legislature, or maybe, your local PTA board. You just need to tailor to your audience. And through that, you need to prepare your messaging. So use social media, use traditional media, write materials, produce things that are tactile, that people can touch, that they can look at, slides they can use in their presentations. And like I did in the beginning, and I'll send all of these slides out so you can have these Louisiana numbers, gather data and stories to back up your message. It's really hard to look at numbers and say, you know what, that's just an outlier. I don't really know about that. That's just one story. So it's important to combine the two. And ultimately, broaden and mobilize your base. So bring others along with you. Part of that is starting to build cross-sector partnerships. So those teachers, healthcare workers, essential workers, we've seen how important housing is to everyone. So make sure that you bring those folks along, and it can really strengthen your message. And it can play to to whatever the interest of a specific policymaker or decision maker is. So again, I've talked through some of these different campaign tools, but I would like to emphasize that you don't want to be waiting until a moment of crisis to start positive relationship building. Already, you're doing a great job. You have a coalition of folks who are coming together to give updates. You've already shared how to meet folks in a new parish that have already been serving their community. This ongoing positive relationship building is really crucial for building the base and foundation of an advocacy campaign, and it can be a big factor to its success. Leverage media, social, traditional media, using Twitter, placing op-eds or letters to the editor in your local paper can be really impactful. especially if you have papers across multiple parishes that are all saying the same message. That can be a great way to convey to your state, hey, housing is an issue not only in New Orleans, but also in Lafayette or also in Houma. Also, don't shy away from doing press briefings, radio, basically exhaust any way of getting your message out. And ultimately, it's a great way to connect directly with your decision makers. So something we do at the National Low Income Housing Coalition is we do calls to action. Click on this link, send an email, call your senator, tell them your story. And when folks are doing that in bulk, when multiple people are doing that every day, they're tallying up today. 4 folks from Louisiana called us and they all talked about this freeze and the lack of preparedness. What are we going to do about it? So there's strength in numbers and there's strength in those direct connections. So meetings, letters, and events or demonstrations are also ways to get on the radar of your elected officials. So I've kind of done a big overview. I will say I can send out all of these links, but we have tons of advocacy resources. And our organization, sounds like much like y'all, is a convener. So we go out and we do these presentations. We also host working group calls and we share information through different resources. We have a campaign about how to bring others along that aren't in the housing space. So we produce fact sheets for folks that are working in labor, folks that are working in healthcare about how important housing is. So you can download all of those fact sheets on our website. All of the numbers I've presented are available at the national level and at Louisiana's level and actually at the metro area. So like we have numbers for Lafayette metro area or New Orleans. And all of that data you can download the graphics for, and it's already ready for like Twitter, already ready for your newsletter. All of this information is prepackaged and ready to go. And ultimately, I'm here today to help also strengthen our own cause and encourage you to take action. So some of the ways you can do that right now are you can get involved with us. We have national calls every week. We have working groups. You can sign up to receive information about what's happening with emergency rental assistance. We have a FEMA working group that I'm going to recommend all of you join. It's every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, where we have folks from across the country talking about some of the challenges and pushing for like, how can we push the administration to ask FEMA to do better on X thing? We also have pre-formatted emails or calls, so you can call or email your member of Congress and not worry about exactly what you're going to say. We'll already have templates set up for you because even I still get stressed when I make those calls. And then we also are circulating an eviction moratorium sign-on letter. It says January 15th, but it's actually March 15th, where we're urging the Biden administration to strengthen and extend the eviction moratorium. So that's one way you can immediately, right after this, sign on to support some of these priorities. I'll put a link in the chat. You can also get this information from us all the time by joining our network as a member. So we offer memberships to individuals and organizations at any amount you feel comfortable with. So I can also send that information along, but our members are our strength. We share your stories, and we're ultimately the voice at the federal level for many practitioners and low-income renters like yourselves. So I've talked a lot, as I said I would, but this is my information. My job is basically to answer any call or any email to support the field. So feel free to send me an email, ask me any questions. I'm readily available and here to support housing and homeless providers across the country. So if anyone has any questions, let me know.
Hi, Olivia. This is Greg Landry. I work with Legal Aid. As you pointed out, even if the current minimum wage increase is passed to $15 an hour, that won't be enough for a full-time minimum wage worker in Louisiana to get even a one-bedroom apartment. I'm wondering if there's any discussion at the federal level about actually increasing the very low-income or low-income housing stock itself, not vouchers. As long as there's a moratorium in place, private landlords are going to be very reluctant to take a person with a voucher, because if the tenant doesn't pay their share of the rent, there's nothing the landlord can do about that. What seems to be a solution to that, and we sort of abandoned this decades ago, is federally owned or locally owned and operated public housing. Is there any talk about going back to that model?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of different solutions out there. And I actually think that they can't be done in silos, right? They all need to be done together, that I believe in a multifaceted approach. And I've heard many of the same concerns that you've shared. We think that it's both, strengthening protections for renters, raising wages that are appropriate, and also increasing the housing supply. So one of the ways that we're looking to do that is to increase funding in the National Housing Trust Fund that would increase supply of housing. We also look at low-income housing tax credits and the expansion so that there would be additional funding to incentivize development. And we do have housing authorities, public housing authorities in our network. So also essentially, we do believe that it's both a supply issue, also protection, also needed resources for the tenants. And I think we support for renters any one of those given solutions. So I think that there's more, I would say there's increased attention at the need for supply, and public housing is one way to support the very lowest income renters, because again, that housing isn't occurring in a private market. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Olivia. Been following the coalition for 3 decades. Love your work, love the materials. Thanks for the help.
Yeah, of course. Like I said, if you have a specific ask about a metro area, or if you have a question about Louisiana, or if, it's great to hear the updates around programs that are working or not, folks who are falling through the gaps, we're seeing that across the country. So any of those updates you share with us, we often will share with HUD or with Treasury when we've asked them, which we just did, to change some of their guidance around their rental assistance program to make it more renter friendly, and to also make it easier for program administrators to get that money out the door. So we don't see a 6-week lag like we're seeing right now. And all of that is by sharing stories like the ones that I've heard on this call.
Hi, Olivia. This is Andrew. I have one question, actually maybe 2. So I may have missed it because I had to step out for a second, but how old is this data? Is this pre-pandemic or during the pandemic that the data from Louisiana came? And also how often is that updated?
So it's updated annually, and actually it uses American Community Survey data from the US Census Bureau. So it's from 2018. There's like a lag that it takes to publish that data. So imagine all of that is pre-pandemic. And we know that the needs have just skyrocketed, right? We'll be publishing a new annual update, but it will still be from 2019. This is 2018 data. So you can just imagine what that need is. And I actually think that's a really great talking point. Like, those numbers are shocking to me, to see how many hours a week you would have to work. And now you factor in how many jobs we've lost, how hard it is to get a job, how many folks are competing for those jobs, and just, again, the lack of available units, how many folks are being displaced. I think the talking point is, this is how bad it was before this catastrophic event. Like, imagine what folks are seeing on the ground now.
In addition, as it relates to housing stock, we've had 2 significant hurricanes that have done quite a bit of damage to housing stock in the region. And so we have even less availability in that regard.
I spoke with a landlord yesterday, and she said she gets 100 applications for one of her low-income properties. So she's only going to go with people that have good rental history and a steady job.
Absolutely. And you see the same on voucher waiting lists. There's just not enough money going from there's not enough federal funding going to support folks. And I feel like I've emphasized that that's not naturally occurring housing, because wages haven't kept up. So folks aren't building for extremely low income individuals. And it's leading to a lot of folks competing for very scarce resources.
Olivia, thanks so much for sharing with us today and for offering these resources and for being willing to share your slideshow. I do want to also mention and say thank you to AOC Community Media. They are recording this and broadcasting it for us on the AOC Community Media channel. And it will be available for watching later since it's recorded. So So thanks to them for doing that, and for each of you for coming here today. As we get to the point of wrapping up, we'll have a brief moment for a couple of quick announcements, but one internal announcement from Arch I'm going to let Elsa talk about real quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that we've started a live video series on the second Wednesday of every month at 6 p.m. It's an effort to demystify the complexities around housing and homelessness for the general public, and help them become invested in our efforts to make shelter, safe and accessible and affordable, and all episodes of homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So as you're able, if you can share those lives, recommend that we're doing it. Our next guest will be Bruce Gilcrease on March 10th. He's going to be talking about all things outreach. What is outreach? How does it logistically work? How can people who are invested and interested and want to play a role, how can they plug in? So again, that's March 10th at 6 p.m. And you can go back and watch the first conversation that we had between me and Lee, where we just sort of laid the very foundation work around what is Arch, what does the coalition do, et cetera. So thank you.
Thanks. Does anybody else have any other announcements you want to share with the group before we conclude? Okay, thanks. Well, we will do this again in 2 months on the fourth Thursday at noon. And next month on the fourth Thursday at noon, it will be a joint meeting of Arch and the Acadiana Housing Alliance. So just mark your calendar for that fourth Thursday at noon, and we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you being here.